They laughed at her face, rolled their eyes at her skin, and spoke about her like she was dirt beneath designer shoes. Before she even sat down, they decided she didn't belong. One flight attendant called her a misstep in boarding, a mistake that somehow slipped past the system. A man in the front row asked if cleaning staff were now allowed up front. A woman clutched her purse like proximity meant threat. No one whispered. They wanted her to hear. They wanted to remind her what this space was and who it was for. But through every sideways glance, every insult wrapped in policy, every fake smile concealing disgust, she didn't break. She didn't argue. She just watched. Because the people who mocked her had no idea who they were humiliating. And by the time they found out, it was too late to apologize. If you think you're ready for what really happened on that flight, hit like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. What would you have done if you were her? And more importantly, how many people like her have we silenced without ever asking who they really are? Ellery Monroe walked with quiet dignity through the jet bridge, her heels steady against the grooved aluminum floor. The scent of fuel lingered in the air, mixed with the synthetic chill of cabin circulation. She adjusted the collar of her cream trench coat, a garment chosen with intention. Clean lines, no logos, tailored but modest. Her blouse was silk, tucked into high-waisted slacks of charcoal gray. She had taken care to dress with precision, as she always did when traveling for business. The black leather travel bag at her side bore no designer branding, but its stitching and finish were unmistakably fine. Still, none of that mattered to the gate agent who stood squarely in her path. The woman's eyes scanned Ellery slowly, first the coat, then the shoes, pausing briefly at the roots of her natural curls before returning to her face. Her lips curled slightly, not in greeting, but in appraisal. The voice that followed was coated in feigned courtesy, but the undertone cut sharp. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right line? This boarding is for first class." Ellery responded with measured calm, presenting her ticket without pause. The agent took it, stared at it longer than necessary, then raised her eyebrows, not in apology, but in quiet disbelief. She handed the ticket back without a word and stepped aside, eyes tracking Ellery as if expecting her to change direction and turn back. Inside the aircraft, the narrow aisle gave way to an open layout of polished luxury. Wide leather seats in hushed earth tones, ambient lighting set to a golden hue, and a bottle of champagne already resting in a cradle near the galley. Ellery stepped into the space with the poise of someone who had earned her place. But even as she paused to find her seat, she felt the stares settle. From the right, a man with silver hair and a Rolex peeking beneath his blazer cuff glanced up, blinked once, then shifted his gaze pointedly toward the overhead bins. To the left, a couple sharing a tablet leaned closer to each other, their whispers not loud but not discreet either. Ellery ignored them. She located to a window seat and began to stow her bag when a sharp voice broke the quiet behind her. A flight attendant, tall, blonde, her hair pulled into a tight bun, stood motionless a few steps away, her eyes fixed on Ellery like she was a loose screw on an otherwise pristine surface. "Ticket, please." Ellery offered it again, and this time the woman didn't bother hiding her scrutiny. Her eyes moved from the boarding pass to Ellery's face and back again. Then, with a breath just short of a scoff, she leaned toward another crew member at the galley and whispered, loud enough for Ellery to catch every syllable, "She must be lost. Freight loads from the back entrance." The other attendant chuckled without looking up. Ellery heard it, absorbed it, stored it. But she said nothing. The blonde attendant turned back, offered a smile so insincere it felt choreographed, and gestured stiffly toward the seat. "Right over there. Try to stay seated once we begin boarding the rest of the cabin." Her tone wasn't hostile, just heavy with presumption, as if she was doing Ellery a favor by letting her stay. Ellery sat down slowly, adjusted the seatbelt across her lap, and glanced outside the window. The tarmac gleamed in the late afternoon sun, runways stretching like ribbons beneath a blue sky. Inside her chest, a familiar pressure began to build, something slow and weighted, not rage, not sadness, but something colder. She didn't let it surface. Not yet. The cabin began to fill. Other passengers boarded, men with monogrammed cufflinks, women in pale scarves and cashmere coats. Each received a nod, a welcome, sometimes even a compliment. Ellery watched it all with a quiet stillness. The attendant's demeanor shifted with each arrival, growing warmer, more relaxed. When one man in a tan suit stumbled over his carry-on, the same blonde who had questioned Ellery laughed and reached to help him. When another woman arrived late, flustered and out of breath, she was offered champagne before her coat was even off. Ellery, meanwhile, sat untouched. Her water glass remained empty. No one asked if she needed anything. She leaned slightly against the window, not quite relaxed but composed, allowing herself a fleeting moment of detachment from the silent hostility she had just endured. That moment shattered the instant the man assigned to seat 2B arrived. He stood for a second, staring at Ellery, as if seeing something unpleasant spilled across his seat. He was in his mid-50s, white-haired, pale-skinned, his polo shirt too tight at the shoulders and the hint of sunburn clinging to his neck. Without speaking, he glanced at the number above, then back at her, and stepped past her to settle in with visible reluctance. The minute his body touched the leather cushion, he shifted away with exaggerated care, then leaned forward to press the call button above him with 2 quick taps. A chime rang. Seconds later, the blonde flight attendant from earlier appeared, her brows lifted in inquiry. The man didn't lower his voice. He turned slightly in his seat and said he needed to be moved. When she asked why, he replied flatly that there was a smell, something strong, unpleasant, and lingering. His words echoed without apology. He gestured toward Ellery with a subtle nod, as if the problem were self-evident. Ellery sat frozen, her spine ramrod straight, her fingers curling inward on her thighs. The attendant's eyes flicked to Ellery, then back to the man. For a second, she looked unsure. Then she offered him a small nod and said she would check availability. As the attendant turned to go, she paused beside Ellery and leaned in. Without lowering her voice, she handed her a moist towelette and muttered something about wiping down her area. Just in case, she said, to maintain hygiene standards. The implication landed like a slap. Ellery took the cloth with fingers made of ice and placed it on her tray table, untouched. The man shifted again, arms crossed, muttering under his breath. He avoided looking at her, but made no effort to hide his body language. Disgust, superiority, the kind of aversion that had no factual basis, only inherited disdain. Ellery's throat burned, but she held her breath and said nothing. Her gaze remained fixed ahead. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the performance of it. He had intended for others to hear. He had wanted to reduce her, and the flight attendant had handed him the tools. The quiet around them deepened as passengers nearby glanced over, then away, pretending not to listen. A woman too rose back, pursed her lips. Another adjusted her scarf and turned her body inward to avoid the view. No one intervened. 10 minutes passed. The attendant returned, apologizing to the man that the cabin was full and that he would have to remain in his current seat for the duration of the flight. His face tightened, but he nodded. He reached into his bag and retrieved a small container of menthol balm, which he dabbed onto his upper lip like a crude defense mechanism. The scent stung the air. Ellery closed her eyes. Her fingers had left crescent moons in her palms from how tightly she was holding herself together. Across the aisle, a different attendant knelt to serve champagne to a couple in matching gray sweaters. They clinked their glasses with gentle laughter, completely absorbed in their own bubble. The dissonance of luxury and cruelty in the same space made the air feel heavier. Ellery finally opened her eyes again. Her chest felt tight. Her body was on fire beneath still skin. She had felt humiliation before, but this one tasted different, not because it was worse, but because of how calmly it was administered. No shouting, no confrontation, just a soft hand offering a disinfectant cloth, like a solution to someone else's discomfort. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, announcing departure preparations and cabin instructions. As the flight crew completed their checks, the man beside Ellery muttered a final insult, inaudible but laced with venom. She could feel it in the curl of his mouth, in the way he pulled the blanket over his lap as though to shield himself. She didn't respond. She wouldn't give him that victory. Instead, she placed her hand on the armrest, let her breath even out, and focused on the rhythm of the engines. She didn't know yet that this flight would become a turning point. She didn't know that her name would soon appear in headlines, or that this moment of forced silence would one day echo in the hallways of boardrooms and Senate hearings. But she knew how pain shaped resolve, and she knew how to remember every detail. Her silence was not surrender. It was storage. She collected every word, every glance, every breathless pause, and filed away. The man beside her had now draped himself in a blanket, turned slightly away as though her existence were a foul scent drifting too close. Across the aisle, a couple whispered beneath clinking glasses, laughing softly as they browsed the flight's premium menu. One row ahead, a young woman scrolled on her phone, pausing now and then to glance back at Ellery with a sideways smirk that vanished whenever their eyes met. Ellery's hands rested lightly on her thighs. Her mouth was dry, her fingers twitched slightly, and she finally pressed the button for service. No one came. She waited, heart beating faster than she would admit. A flight attendant passed moments later, wheeling a cart of beverages, but did not glance in her direction. A second cart followed a few minutes later, offering champagne to the seats adjacent and opposite hers. She sat still, button pressed, light glowing above her head, but no one stopped. Her throat tightened. She pressed the button again. Still nothing. Her seat neighbor shifted, grumbling beneath his breath, adjusting his blanket as though annoyed that her request even existed. Another attendant passed. Ellery raised a hand gently, a motion devoid of desperation, but heavy with restrained grace. The attendant's eyes flicked toward her, paused for the briefest second, then kept walking. The sense of deliberate neglect seeped through her like ice water. Time became slow. The sounds of clinking glasses, muted television chatter, and rustling pages blurred together. Finally, nearly 20 minutes after her initial request, the blonde attendant returned, now carrying a tray with a glass of water. She did not offer it with poise or grace. She set it down heavily on Ellery's tray table with a loud, wet thud, causing some to spill over onto the surface. She didn't apologize. Instead, she looked directly at Ellery, her voice calm but sharp enough to slice. Please be mindful of how often you use the call button. It's for emergencies or important needs. We ask that passengers familiarize themselves with the service policy before boarding. Then she turned and walked away. Ellery stared at the spilled water, its droplets glistening on the smooth plastic, forming small puddles beside her hand. She picked up the glass, took a measured sip, and placed it back down with deliberate silence. No expression crossed her face. No protest rose from her lips. But the shame simmered beneath her skin like heat trapped under glass. She dabbed the moisture with the napkin she had tucked into the corner of the tray, the smallest, most degrading cleanup she had ever performed in a space built to exalt privilege. Moments later, a child passed her row. A girl no older than 7, dressed in a pastel sweater and pink sneakers, trailed behind her mother, chattering softly. As they reached Ellery's seat, the girl slowed, pulled gently at her mother's sleeve, and asked in a whisper that pierced the stillness, "Why is the cleaning lady sitting up here?" The mother paused, glanced once at Ellery, and gave a soft, amused laugh. "Because sometimes the world forgets how to keep standards," she replied, and gently guided her daughter forward. The words landed without echo, but they did not need one. Ellery heard them clearly. She heard them in her spine, in her throat, in the places no armor could reach. No one corrected the child. No one defended the woman in seat 2A. Around her, the cabin resumed its rhythm. The child disappeared into the next aisle, and the mother adjusted her coat and sat back into her seat like she had just performed a civic duty. Ellery swallowed her breath, her fingers twitching once again before curling into her palms. She did not look around. She did not wipe away the residue of insult. She did nothing because doing something would suggest she had been surprised, and she had not. She had expected this. She always expected this. But no matter how many times it arrived, it still left bruises beneath the skin. Time passed. The scent of hot food began to drift from the galley, signaling the start of the meal service. Trays clinked and carts rolled down the aisle. Ellery knew what came next. She waited, eyes still forward, heart slow, body still. She heard the approach. Her tray table was cleared silently. A cold, untouched appetizer was placed before her, smaller than the others, without dressing, without bread, and without a word. The man next to her received the full spread. 3 courses, warm rolls, wine. She received water and lettuce and silence. As flight attendants moved through the rows, their voices softened to gentle suggestions as they offered options: filet, salmon, risotto, each name spoken like a promise, a sign of care that was reserved only for certain passengers. The carts passed her row once, then again, without slowing. Ellery watched the move, saw every tray served to every person around her, noted every glass of wine poured and every dessert selected with care. But her tray table remained bare. No one stopped. No one looked at her. They moved as if her seat was empty. After 20 minutes, she raised her hand subtly. The blonde attendant caught the movement, but did not react immediately. When she did return, it was without a tray. Instead, she held a narrow white box sealed in plastic, the kind typically distributed in coach during turbulence. She dropped it on the table without a word, and when Ellery looked up, calm, composed, in quiet question, the attendant offered a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "We ran out of the special orders," she said curtly. "This is all we have left. You should have requested yours earlier." Ellery did not respond. She knew this was a performance. The box contained a sandwich, cold and compressed into its wrapping like an afterthought. No utensils, no sides, no apology. The insult was calculated, just like everything else. As Ellery slowly peeled back the wrapper, the man seated in 3C leaned forward, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Is that tuna? Smells like it came from a gas station." The passengers around him chuckled. He grinned, pleased with himself, then turned to look at her more directly. "That hair too," he added. "Looks like the sandwich was sitting on it. You might want to comb it before someone reports it as wildlife." The laughter this time was fuller, sharper, more intentional. 2 women in matching cashmere scarves laughed behind raised hands. The man in one besmirked over his wine glass. No one told him to stop. No one told him he was out of line. The flight attendants continued to serve with smiles as though nothing had happened. Ellery blinked once, slowly, then lowered her eyes back to the sandwich. She did not look at the man, nor at the others. Her hands remained still, though her fingers tightened ever so slightly against the edge of the plastic box. She placed the sandwich back on the tray without taking a bite. She had no appetite now, not for food, not for conversation, not for dignity reclaimed through confrontation. She had long since learned that raising your voice in a space built to suppress, it only gave others permission to turn your defense into disruption. She remained silent. The plane hummed on, suspended in sky, but saturated in human rot. She could feel the judgment around her thickening, feel it nesting in the back of her neck, like static. Her hair, coiled and natural, had always been a point of attention. In childhood, it was tugged at by classmates and labeled wild. In college, it was touched without consent, praised in one breath and mocked in another. In corporate boardrooms, it was questioned. Would you consider straightening it, as though professionalism was tied to texture? Today, it had been reduced to foliage. A man had looked at her and seen wilderness. Others had heard him and laughed. And not a single voice had intervened. She breathed in deeply through her nose, letting the air settle in her lungs before exhaling just as slowly. The act did not calm her, but it centered her. She had no recourse here. No platform, no witness, no authority that would side with her word against the cabin's curated narrative. If she raised a complaint, she would become the problem. If she showed anger, she would be labeled unstable. If she shed a tear, it would be dismissed as overreaction. So she sat still. She stored it. She waited. Outside the window, the clouds thinned into a soft blue gradient. The world below was distant and peaceful, untouched by the cruelty hovering 35,000 feet above. Inside, the meal service ended. Trays were cleared. Dessert carts rolled by. The man in 3C received a slice of cake and another glass of whiskey. The woman beside him offered a quiet cheers, and he raised his glass with a smirk, tilting it slightly toward Ellery's seat as if to toast his own cleverness. Her tray remained. The cold sandwich sat untouched. She did not request its removal. She let it sit as a reminder, not to others, but to herself. The lights dimmed slightly as the cabin transitioned into rest mode. Flight attendants began distributing blankets and slippers. Ellery was passed over again. No offering, no acknowledgement. When the man beside her received his pillow, he turned once more with the smugness of a boy rewarded for cruelty. "Don't forget to ask for yours," he said, voice syrupy with mock concern. "Unless they're saving them for, people who pay full fare." More laughter, more silence. Ellery did not move. The laughter had faded. The man behind her had reclined with a self-satisfied sigh, and most others had returned to their movies or drifted into shallow sleep, content in their cloistered cocoon above the clouds. Ellery did not sleep. Her mind had sharpened into a blade, not angry, but alert, tracing the patterns of what had happened, calculating what could still come. She was pulling her bag up from under the seat in front of her, reaching for her notebook to jot down details while they were still fresh in her memory, when a soft chime sounded above her. She looked up. The blonde flight attendant approached, holding a tablet, face unusually blank. She leaned in without a greeting, lowered her voice, and said, "Ms. Monroe, I've just received an update from ground operations. There's been a notification regarding your ticket status. According to our system, your reservation has been flagged for irregular activity and is no longer valid." The words were clear, the meaning clearer. Ellery stared at her, momentarily stunned not by surprise, but by the boldness. "Flagged?" she asked, her voice low and even. "For what?" The attendant didn't flinch. "Behavior inconsistent with FAA safety guidelines," she replied. "Specifically, actions interpreted as disruptive or confrontational toward staff." Her tone was clinical, designed for documentation, not discussion. Ellery's spine straightened even further. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. "I haven't raised my voice. I haven't stood for my seat. I haven't violated a single rule," she said. "Is that what your records show?" The attendant didn't answer. She simply gestured toward the tablet, as if the screen itself held the truth. Then, in the same flat tone, she added, "I've been instructed to notify you that you may be subject to removal from future Meridian Airlines flights, pending review." And just like that, she walked away. Ellery sat frozen for a moment. Her ears rang with the white noise of injustice. The room tilted slightly, not from turbulence, but from the weight of realization. They were not content with ignoring her, not content with insulting her. Now, they were rewriting the facts, issuing false charges, and planting digital fingerprints that would outlast the flight. She pulled out her phone with swift precision and opened the airline's mobile app. Her booking was no longer visible. The reservation code returned an error. She tried the website next. Same result, reservation not found. She blinked hard, as if trying to clear fog from glass. Then she tapped the airline's customer service number. The automated voice greeted her with syrupy enthusiasm, asking her to confirm her name and flight number. She followed the prompts. She was placed on hold, listening to classical music interrupted every 30 seconds by an automated reassurance. "Your call is important to us." 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. A representative finally answered. Her voice was rushed, clipped. Ellery calmly explained the situation, stating her name, her confirmation code, the message from the flight attendant. The line went silent for a few seconds. Then the woman on the phone said she could not find a record of that ticket under Ellery's name. Ellery repeated the details, slowly, clearly. The representative apologized, claimed there might be a system update delay, put her on hold again. 10 more minutes passed. Then the call dropped. Ellery stared at the screen. She called again. The same prompts. This time, she was routed to another department. She explained everything again. This representative told her that due to ongoing verification, her reservation was temporarily inaccessible, and that she would need to call back during business hours. It was past midnight Eastern Time. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the armrest. She had flown hundreds of times, navigated bureaucracies on multiple continents, handled operations that involved more red tape than an entire airport's manifest. But never had a company fabricated a misconduct accusation mid-flight and used it to erase her presence from a system. She turned the phone off, sat back, closed her eyes. The pressure in her chest was no longer humiliation. It was the metallic weight of being targeted, erased in real time while still breathing in the same seat. Her body was still, but her mind raced. The implications were brutal. Once that report entered the system, it would follow her. Airline alliances shared incident records. Her ability to fly freely, to book international work, to travel for the foundation she funded, could all be undermined with a few lines of falsified language in a secure database. And worse, her silence, her restraint, her refusal to respond to each small assault, was now being twisted into something weaponized against her. She opened her notebook, flipped to a blank page, and began writing. Names, times, exact phrases. She recalled the moment the gate agent's eyes skimmed her coat, the second the man next to her sprayed cologne into the air, the box sandwich, the laughter about her hair, the missed water service, the moment the flight attendant told her she should have read the guidelines, the fabricated flag on her booking, the dropped calls. The sandwich still sat uneaten, its plastic reflecting the soft overhead lights like a monument to contempt. She had not spoken in nearly an hour, not out of fear, but because there was nothing left to clarify. The message had been delivered in full. Her presence was unwanted. Her silence had been rebranded as threat. And now, the cabin around her shifted once more, from passive exclusion to open condescension. Across the aisle, a murmur began, low and intentional. A man in a designer blazer leaned forward in conversation with another passenger, his voice just loud enough to carry. "You see the 1 and 2, he said. "She's been flagged. Internal notice from the company. Apparently, she's a disruption case. They're monitoring it closely. It's protocol for outliers who push boundaries." The word outliers landed with precision. It wasn't racial on the surface, but it was coded. And everyone in the first-class cabin understood the code. One row back, a woman whispered that her husband worked in corporate risk. She'd heard of incidents like this, where certain profiles made others uncomfortable. "They have to contain it," she said, "or it spreads. You know how easily one person can ruin an experience for the rest of us." Ellery heard them. She didn't turn her head, but each word carved its mark with surgical precision. Her hands stayed folded. Her body remained composed. But inside, her pulse shifted from simmer to steel. Then came the second strike. A passenger seated in 1D, a man whose shoes cost more than most paychecks, stood up to stretch. He turned slightly toward a row, eyes narrowed in practiced arrogance. He spoke without looking directly at her, his tone casual and cutting. "The problem," he said, "is not that she's here. It's that she thinks she belongs here. There's a difference." The woman beside him chuckled softly, taking a sip of her wine. He continued, adjusting his cufflink. "This cabin works because we all know the unspoken rules. You don't just buy a seat. You carry yourself with understanding. Certain people think money alone buys access, but it doesn't. It never did." His words were pointed, but his face never turned toward her. He didn't need to look at her. He knew she was listening. That was the point. Ellery closed her notebook and placed it on the empty seat between her and the aisle. She no longer needed to write. Her memory had already become photographic, not because she wanted it to, but because it had to. Every slight, every phrase, every decision made under the guise of order. She had stored it, and now they were no longer hiding. The curated professionalism had given way to open arrogance. No more coded language. No more plausible deniability. Just a room full of polished cruelty dressed in fine fabrics and airline champagne. She turned her head, slowly, gazing through the small window beside her. The clouds had thinned. Below them, the distant lights of the eastern seaboard twinkled against the darkness like a shattered net of gold. The city was close. The descent would begin soon. But the landing would not mark the end. Not this time. The blonde flight attendant reappeared with a small notepad in hand, face now smooth with corporate polish. "Ms. Monroe," she began, "a manager from our ground team will be meeting you upon landing. It's standard in cases involving safety flagging." Her voice was practiced, neutral, but beneath the words sat an unmistakable edge of superiority. Ellery looked at her calmly. She asked nothing. She answered nothing. The flight attendant hesitated, then added, "We just want to make sure expectations are managed." Then she walked away. They weren't just trying to silence her. They were preparing the ground, preparing the story. If she objected, they would label her aggressive. If she remained silent, they would call her non-compliant. Either way, they would twist it. Either way, they would win, unless she rewrote the ending. The plane began to descend. The man in 3C, who had mocked her hair, her meal, her presence, leaned forward once more and chuckled to his companion. "I hope security's waiting. I don't like flying with people who don't know how to behave." His companion laughed and nodded. "You'd think people would learn. First class isn't for everyone. It's not about race, it's about class. You either belong or you don't." The word class hit like a drumbeat. And once again, no one corrected him. No one intervened. The silence in the cabin became complicity. The cruelty communal. She had said nothing as the descent began, nothing as the whispers continued, nothing when the flight attendant walked past her with a smirk, reminding her, without words, that someone from ground control was waiting. But the silence had never meant surrender. It had meant preparation. As the aircraft rolled into position and the door clicked open, a senior operations officer stepped on board, distinguished by his tailored suit, his earpiece, his clipboard, and the way he scanned the cabin with authority forged in procedure and polished bias. He reached a row, eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced down, and said her name with formal coldness. "Ms. Monroe, I'll need you to come with me for a brief debriefing regarding in-flight conduct concerns." Around her, several passengers paused their disembarkment to observe. A few smirked. One woman in a beige coat whispered, "Knew it," while the man in 3C grinned as if the verdict had already been delivered. Ellery rose slowly, adjusted her coat with deliberate grace, collected her notebook and phone, and walked toward the front of the plane, flanked by the officer who seemed almost eager to escort her into a corridor of corporate discipline. But outside the aircraft, the script changed. The corridor beyond the gate was not empty. Waiting there stood two individuals in dark suits bearing the insignia of Federal Regulatory Council. Beside them, a sharply dressed woman with a press badge hung over a navy blouse raised a camera phone the moment Ellery stepped forward. Flash. Then another. The officer escorting her hesitated, sensing the shift in atmosphere, but Ellery kept walking. She turned slightly, offered the smallest of nods to the suited pair, and continued through the terminal without a word. The crowd did not yet understand. The crew did not yet see what they had done, but the tremor had begun. By the time Ellery reached the executive lounge, a private room with glass walls and velvet silence, a secure call had already been placed. Within 20 minutes, a pre-scheduled press conference began broadcasting quietly from an unlisted stream, then was picked up and shared by an independent aviation outlet known for tracking corporate scandals. The headline was clear. Chairwoman of $42 billion global capital group detained post-flight by own airline staff. The anchor's voice cut through the smooth hum of background jazz. Ellery Monroe, founder and chair of Tien Tuong Equity Holdings, one of the principal institutional stakeholders of Meridian Airlines, was allegedly subjected to targeted profiling, harassment, and internal blacklisting on Flight 607 from San Francisco to New York. Images followed. A blurred shot of her in Seat 2A, the gate number. Then a flash of legal documentation outlining her firm's stake in the airline's Infrastructure Investment Board. The anchor continued. Sources close to MS. Monroe confirmed that her legal team is preparing to submit a formal inquiry to the Department of Transportation and the SEC regarding internal discrimination policies that directly violate board governance agreements. Within 90 minutes of landing, Ellery's official statement was issued across select business networks. It was short, direct, impeccably timed. In response to today's incident, I am initiating an immediate suspension of Tien Tuong's financial participation in Meridian Airlines and its affiliate routes. Effective immediately, we are withdrawing operational liquidity extensions and halting further infrastructure commitments pending full investigation. Current holdings to be re-evaluated for divestment. The number was attached at the bottom of the release. $2.6 billion in combined investment. The markets reacted before sunrise. By 5:43 a.m. Eastern, Meridian's pre-market stock had dropped 11%. By 6:12, the airline's corporate line was swamped with requests for comment. By 7 o'clock, the story had hit 2 national outlets and was trending under multiple tags, not because Ellery had posted anything, but because truth doesn't always need a spotlight. It only needs a moment of alignment. And every person on that plane who thought they could reduce her to inconvenience had just made her unforgettable. Back in the terminal, the flight staff who had smiled at her exclusion were now locked in urgent meetings. The manager who had flagged her ticket for potential escalation risk had gone silent after being informed that the incident log had been cross-referenced with a directorial signature from the airline's own investor council, the one Ellery chaired. The gate agent who had first doubted her presence had gone home early, citing stress. The blonde attendant? Reassigned pending review. The man from seat 3C? Now featured as an anonymous quote in an article titled First Class, Second Class Ethics. International media outlets picked up the story before most passengers from Flight 607 had even unpacked. By 9 a.m. Eastern, the coverage had spread from American business newsrooms to global headlines. BBC, Al Jazeera, Reuters, and Le Monde all reported on the story not just as a corporate scandal, but as a symbol of modern discrimination masked by luxury and professionalism. Their focus shifted from Ellery's retaliation to the deeper architecture behind what had happened, asking not just why one woman had been humiliated, but how a global airline, funded in part by people like her, had normalized that humiliation as standard practice. Dozens of passengers from other flights began to come forward, their emails flooding press inboxes with eerily similar accounts. Black and brown travelers spoke of last-minute seat reassignments, inexplicable boarding delays, service irregularities that were never logged but always felt. The patterns were not exact, but they were undeniable. A new headline emerged from an independent whistleblower blog titled The Quiet Cabin Divide. The article detailed incidents stretching back 6 years, none of which had been investigated beyond internal protocol. A former customer experience analyst at Meridian Airlines wrote under pseudonym, "We were told not to call it discrimination. We were told to use terms like risk flag, behavioral forecasting, and comfort optimization." But it wasn't until the leak came that the floodgates truly opened. At 10:26 a.m., an anonymous upload appeared on a secure whistleblower portal used by journalists and legal watchdogs. The file was simple, a set of internal training slides and a chain of executive emails dated just 3 months earlier. The subject line read, "Revised Passenger Visibility Risk Index." The content was damning. The documents revealed a color-coded system used by internal operations staff to assess passenger behavior based not on actions, but on appearance, accent, and nonverbal presentation traits. Though the language was buried in corporate euphemism, the implication was unmistakable. Phrases like disruption probability score, passenger integration concern, and brand aesthetic friction were used to categorize people. One email directly referenced passengers exhibiting behavior outside elite travel culture norms, especially invisible demographics likely to invite public scrutiny. The system, referred to internally as Project Horizon, was authorized by 2 high-ranking vice presidents and implemented via gate agent briefings and flight attendant training modules. Its intent was clear: to quietly filter and redirect passengers deemed unfit for the airline's first-class brand image, all under the guise of behavioral management. The backlash was immediate and global. Civil rights organizations launched formal inquiries. Transportation watchdog groups demanded access to every internal document related to the policy. Government regulators scheduled emergency sessions to determine whether Meridian had violated anti-discrimination clauses in federal aviation law. Protests began forming outside Meridian's headquarters in 3 major cities. By noon, 3 other airlines were named in related documents, indicating the practice wasn't isolated but widespread across the luxury travel sector. Meanwhile, inside Meridian's corporate tower, panic spread like wildfire. The legal department scrambled to initiate internal containment, while HR attempted damage control with statements about diversity commitment and cultural learning. But the public had stopped listening. What had started as a response to Ellery's silence now screamed with the voices of thousands who had experienced the same brand of curated exclusion. Social media campaigns surged not with hashtags alone, but with live documentation. Videos surfaced from past flights, photographs of flight attendants ignoring call lights, audio clips of passengers being told to move without explanation. The system had counted on silence. But silence was over. In boardrooms, Meridian executives debated how to address Ellery Monroe directly. Some argued for private settlement. Others suggested reinstating her investment through a formal apology. One internal memo even proposed a donation in her name to racial equity foundations as a symbolic gesture. But none of it would work. Ellery's decision was irreversible, not because of pride, but because of principle. She had not just exposed a rot within Meridian. She had exposed an entire culture's willingness to accept that rot so long as it wore a polished badge. By late afternoon, Ellery's identity had become a case study in corporate responsibility. Publications began highlighting her achievements, her philanthropic work, her background as a woman who had built her empire not from inheritance, but from strategy and grit. She had never led with her name. She had let the work speak. But now the world spoke her name because the silence had cost too much. Inside the airline's crisis room, a single email was read aloud. It came from a former senior flight coordinator who had resigned after pushing back against Project Horizon. The email concluded with one line that echoed louder than any press release. You cannot curate dignity out of your brand and expect to sell it as luxury. The silence in the room that followed was not strategic. It was stunned. The corporate facade cracked under the weight of its own contradictions. Stockholders, panicked by the mass divestment spearheaded by Tien Tuong Equity and fueled by other funds joining in silent protest, demanded immediate change. Emergency board meetings were held behind layers of non-disclosure agreements, but leaks made their way to journalists within hours. One leak included a direct quote from a senior board member saying, "She warned us. We didn't listen. Now the whole house is burning." The she was obvious. The house was Meridian's crumbling credibility. By the end of the 3rd day, the airline's CEO, Warren McAllister, was no longer in office. The board issued a formal statement citing leadership transition in response to recent ethical concerns. But the truth was louder than the language. He had been forced out not just for mishandling a scandal, but for having authorized the very systems that enabled it. His signature appeared on one of the Project Horizon authorization memos, and his public comments from earlier that year, defending the airline's approach to brand consistency and passenger cohesion, were now being dissected line by line in public hearings. With his resignation, the spotlight turned to those beneath him, and a domino effect of accountability began. The United States Department of Transportation issued a federal notice within a week, confirming the launch of a targeted investigation into racial bias in commercial aviation service structures. Meridian was the primary subject, but the investigation promised a wider reach, hinting that the airline's practices had inspired or mirrored similar policies across the industry. Subpoenas were issued, testimonies were scheduled, and beneath the surface of public outrage, a legal war quietly ignited. On the front lines of that war stood the names from Flight 607, The blonde flight attendant who had first challenged Ellery's presence was named in two separate lawsuits, one from a civil rights organization citing pattern behavior, and another from Ellery's own legal team, not out of vengeance, but out of principle. The gate agent at the departure terminal, whose name had once been tucked safely behind a badge, was now the subject of a disciplinary hearing and internal ethics review. Her statement, recorded in an operations log and leaked to the press, had used the phrase best to redirect her for cohesion purposes. That single sentence became a case study in institutional euphemism. The man from Seat 3C, once proud of his cruelty, now faced public identification through social media exposure. His employer, a multinational firm with a strict code of conduct, placed him on indefinite leave and launched an internal investigation. His face, blurred in early footage, was now etched into the public record of passengers who mistook their privilege for immunity. He issued a statement 2 days later claiming he had acted under the influence of stress and alcohol. But it was too late. He had become a symbol, not of a villain, but of the bystander emboldened by silence, the enabler in a tailored suit. Meanwhile, Meridian's HR department scrambled to create a new task force for diversity and passenger equity. But the move was dismissed as performative. No one trusted slogans anymore. Investors didn't want PR. They wanted structure. Ellery's response remained consistent. No interviews, no public appearances, only movement. Her foundation announced a new initiative to provide legal resources for airline passengers facing discrimination, funded directly by redirected capital from her suspended Meridian investment. "They took my seat," she wrote in the official mission statement. "So now I'm building a platform they can't touch." The initiative received over $1 million in public donations in its first 48 hours. Across the industry, policies began to shift. Airlines long praised for their discretion and exclusivity now faced questions about their standards. Shareholders asked about service patterns. Unions asked about whistleblower protection. Airlines that had once thrived on silence now had to speak and mean it. Meanwhile, transportation regulators from other countries began launching their own parallel investigations, inspired by the breadth of the Meridian fallout. But the most profound consequence came not in legal filings or stock dips. It came in recognition. Travelers, especially those who had spent years swallowing quiet indignities, finally saw the system crack. In airports, in lounges, in forums once reserved for elite travel tips, conversations shifted. People asked better questions. People remembered Ellery's name, not just because she held power, but because she had refused to pretend everything was fine. She had taken every insult, every dismissal, and turned it into proof. And the world had seen it. Months passed, but the echo of the flight that shook an industry did not fade. It deepened, filtered into new conversations, bled into policy reviews, shaped reforms not through shouting, but through steady change and undeniable consequence. The public had not forgotten, but the tone had shifted. What had once been fury settled into reflection. And as dust cleared, some of the faces behind the harm, once so confident in their status and silence, emerged again, not to justify, but to reconcile. The man who had orchestrated Ellery Monroe's removal from the aircraft, the operations manager who had approached her with rehearsed coldness and procedural dismissal, found his world upended not by legal retribution, but by something heavier: conscience. After his termination and public exposure, he disappeared from corporate life entirely. Anonymous for a time, he re-emerged 7 months later at a community forum on racial equity, hosted in partnership with Tien Tuong Foundation. The event was not designed for spectacle, only for healing, for confronting systems of harm through uncomfortable truth. He sat in the back of the hall, unrecognized at first, until Ellery herself took the stage not as a headline or a symbol, but as a woman reclaiming a shared future. Her speech was measured, never bitter, focused not on punishment, but on transformation. When it ended, and the floor opened for discussion, he stood. The room held its breath as he walked slowly toward the mic. He cleared his throat, visibly shaken, and admitted not just to his role in what had happened on that flight, but to the culture he had perpetuated for years, quietly, efficiently. without ever questioning the way things were designed to function. His voice cracked. I believed I was just following protocol, but I never asked who the protocol protected, and I never stopped to ask who it erased. He paused, then said something no one expected. I don't ask for forgiveness. I just wanted to tell the truth. Finally, the silence that followed was heavier than applause. Ellery stood still, her face unreadable. Then, without a word, she nodded once. It was not absolution. It was acknowledgement. And sometimes that was the beginning of change. Elsewhere, other ripples continued. The man from Seat 3C, the one who had mocked her hair, who had bathed in laughter that day as if humiliation were theater, had vanished from the public eye after the scandal broke. His company had severed ties, and his reputation, once built on boardroom dominance, became synonymous with arrogance. But what the world didn't know was what happened next. 3 months after losing his job, he showed up at a small community outreach center in Chicago, under a different name, seeking volunteer work. He stayed quiet about who he was, scrubbing dishes, organizing supplies, helping at literacy sessions. For weeks, he didn't say much, but he showed up again and again. The staff noticed his consistency, his silence, his discomfort around cameras. Eventually, the director of the nonprofit discovered who he had been, what role he had played in the Meridian scandal, and confronted him. He didn't deny it. He just said, I don't want to fix the past. I just want to make sure someone else doesn't become me. Later that year, Ellery was invited to that same center as part of a foundation partnership. She didn't recognize him at first. His hair was longer, his eyes quieter. But when he saw her, he stepped back into the kitchen without drawing attention. He didn't speak to her. He didn't need to. Change, when real, doesn't perform. It labors. The blonde flight attendant who had handed Ellery the cold sandwich, the one who had smiled while delivering exclusion wrapped in formality, had relocated to a small town far from aviation after being dismissed. For a time, she retreated from public view, angry at first, blaming the cancel culture narrative. But over time, isolated from the systems that had once upheld her behavior, she began to reflect. She started attending local forums on unconscious bias, then became a facilitator. She wasn't perfect. She never claimed to be. But when she eventually spoke on her experience, she said something that stayed with many. The hardest part wasn't losing the job. It was realizing how easy it had been to believe I was just being professional when I was really being cruel. She never reached out to Ellery directly. She said she didn't have the right. But she made sure the young women she now trained understood one truth. Silence in the face of bias is a decision, not a default. Ellery Monroe, for her part, never centered herself in these stories. She did not brand her pain. She did not build a career on victimhood. She continued her work, quietly expanding the foundation, launching a scholarship named after her late mother for Black girls pursuing international policy degrees, advising organizations not with bitterness, but with strategic clarity. She never rejoined Meridian's board. When they offered to reinstate her seat and asked her to participate in their new ethics council, she declined with one line, I don't reform systems that refuse to rebuild. Instead, she took her vision to broader spaces, transportation policy, infrastructure equity, cultural competency initiatives across industries. She became a quiet architect of accountability, choosing legacy over revenge. And so the story that began in a narrow aisle of a luxury cabin, where a woman was told she didn't belong, ended not with revenge, but with return of dignity, of memory, of consequence, of human potential redeemed not through spectacle, but through reckoning. The flight was over, but the journey she triggered continued. Not just in lawsuits or articles, but in every whispered conversation that now had to stop and think, in every corporate boardroom that had to change policy not for image, but for integrity, in every ordinary person who finally realized that justice wasn't about volume. It was about vision. The end. If this story moved you, take a moment to like and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. What part of Ellery's journey impacted you the most? Do you think justice was truly served in the end? Or is there more to uncover? Tell us in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? And what would you have done if you were in her seat? We're reading every word.